A crown only falls when everyone who should defend it decides to look away. The sound echoed softly through the enormous throne hall as the alien queen's fractured crown rolled across polished marble like a forgotten coin. The chamber of the Celestine court stretched nearly 200 feet from end to end, its vaulted ceiling glowing with soft violet light from floating crystal lanterns. Tall pillars carved from translucent stone rose like frozen lightning bolts toward the ceiling, reflecting the quiet tension that filled the air. Hundreds of nobles stood arranged in perfect rows along the wide ceremonial floor, their jeweled robes shimmering with iridescent color, yet none of them moved. At the center of the hall stood Queen Lyriath, ruler of the Aurelian Empire, her turquoise skin catching the pale light like polished glass. She was nearly 7 feet tall, elegant and composed, yet the silence surrounding her felt heavier than gravity. According to tradition older than most civilizations in the galaxy, this was the day of renewal, the ceremony where every noble house reaffirmed loyalty by kneeling before the throne. It was supposed to be a simple act, a symbolic gesture lasting only seconds. But today the hall felt frozen in time. One by one, the nobles had stepped forward when their names were called, and one by one, they had chosen not to kneel. Some offered polite bows, others only quiet nods, and a few simply stared forward with cold indifference. No one spoke openly against the queen, but the message was unmistakable. Support had vanished. Respect had evaporated. The empire that had once stretched across dozens of star systems now stood balanced on the edge of quiet rebellion. High above the chamber floor, hidden behind a maintenance railing nearly 40 feet up, a human watched everything unfold with wide, uncertain eyes. Ethan Walker tightened his grip on the metal ladder beside him as he crouched in the narrow service corridor running along the upper wall. He wasn't supposed to be here for history. He was supposed to be fixing an overheating ventilation unit that had been rattling for 2 days. His grease-stained toolkit sat open beside him, a small diagnostic screen still blinking with warnings. Ethan was a maintenance contractor, not a diplomat, not a soldier, and definitely not someone who belonged anywhere near an imperial ceremony. But when the doors had opened earlier and the nobles began filing in below, curiosity had pinned him in place. From his perch above the hall, the entire scene felt unreal, like watching a documentary unfold beneath his boots. He had seen political standoffs before back on Earth, but nothing like this. No shouting, no chaos, just a silent rejection spreading through the room like winter frost. Down below, Queen Lyriath stood completely still as the final noble name echoed through the chamber. No one stepped forward. No one knelt. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the palace energy grid vibrating through the walls. Ethan glanced down at the lonely figure of the queen, and something about the image tightened in his chest. A ruler surrounded by hundreds of powerful allies, yet somehow standing completely alone. The silence stretched longer. Uncomfortable. Heavy. The kind of silence where everyone waits for someone else to act first. And that was when Ethan Walker slowly stood up. The first sound anyone noticed was not a voice but the slow metallic creak of a service ladder shifting against the wall nearly 40 feet above the throne floor. Ethan Walker paused halfway down the rungs, one hand gripping the cool alloy rail, while the other still held the diagnostic tablet he had forgotten to drop. From this close the throne hall looked even larger than it had from the upper corridor. The polished marble floor stretched wider than a basketball court and reflected the pale violet light of the floating crystal lanterns like a frozen lake. Hundreds of nobles stood in perfect rows, their jeweled cloaks whispering softly each time someone shifted their weight. None of them looked up yet. None of them expected a human maintenance contractor to suddenly descend into the middle of the most important ceremony in the empire. Ethan reached the last rung and stepped onto the floor, the rubber soles of his work boots tapping quietly against the marble. The sound carried farther than he expected. A few heads turned, then a few more. A murmur moved through the hall like wind passing across tall grass. Humans were rare in the imperial court, and when they appeared it was usually in uniforms or diplomatic attire. Ethan wore neither. His dark maintenance jacket still carried a faint smear of grease across one sleeve, and a small tool pouch hung awkwardly from his belt. He immediately realized that walking out here might be the worst professional decision of his life. Still, Something in his chest refused to let him climb back up that ladder and pretend he had not seen what happened. Down at the center of the chamber, Queen Lyriath had not moved. She stood with quiet composure, tall and steady. Yet the cracked crown resting several feet away on the marble floor made the moment feel unfinished, like a sentence that had lost its final word. Ethan swallowed and started walking. Each step echoed across the hall. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. The nobles watched him now with open curiosity, some with confusion, others with barely hidden irritation. A few whispered to one another in low alien dialects that Ethan could not fully understand, but the tone was clear enough. The human had wandered somewhere he did not belong. Ethan kept moving anyway. The air near the throne felt cooler, almost ceremonial, as if the palace climate systems recognized the importance of the space. When he finally stopped a few feet from the queen, he realized she was even taller than he expected. Her turquoise skin reflected the soft lantern light with a faint glow, and her silver crown markings along her temples looked almost like starlight frozen into living form. Her golden eyes settled on him with calm curiosity rather than anger. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan glanced once at the cracked crown lying on the marble floor. Then he slowly lowered himself onto one knee. The movement was simple, one knee touching the polished stone, one hand resting lightly against his chest, his head bowing forward in quiet respect. The entire hall inhaled at once. The silence that followed was so deep Ethan could hear the faint hum of the palace power grid running through the walls. Hundreds of nobles stared as if they had just witnessed something impossible. A human had performed the ancient gesture none of them would give. Ethan remained still, suddenly aware that he had no speech prepared, no grand explanation, and absolutely no idea what would happen next. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched across the throne hall like a held breath, heavy and uncertain. Ethan Walker remained on one knee, his gaze lowered toward the polished marble floor where the faint reflection of the floating crystal lanterns shimmered like distant stars. He had expected someone to shout, perhaps a guard to step forward, or one of the nobles to protest that a human had crossed a line no outsider should approach. Instead, there was only quiet. From his lowered position, Ethan could still hear the subtle movement of robes shifting and the faint electronic hum of the palace power grid running through the walls. For a long moment, the entire court seemed to be trying to understand what had just happened. Then Queen Lyriath moved. The motion was small but unmistakable. She stepped forward once, the soft contact of her ceremonial boots touching the marble with a sound so light it almost disappeared into the vast chamber. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes just enough to see her standing directly in front of him now, her tall silhouette framed by the pale violet glow from the ceiling lanterns. Up close, the details of her presence were even more striking than from across the room. Fine silver markings traced along her temples like delicate constellations, and her golden eyes held a calm focus that felt less like judgment and more like curiosity. She studied him for several seconds without speaking, as though examining a puzzle that had appeared where none had been expected. Around them, the nobles watched with growing tension. Some leaned slightly forward, others whispered behind raised sleeves, but none dared interrupt the moment unfolding at the center of the hall. Finally, the queen spoke, her voice smooth and steady, carrying easily through the chamber without the need for amplification. "Human," she said, the word neither insult nor praise, simply a quiet acknowledgement of what he was. "Why do you kneel when those who swore loyalty will not?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan felt suddenly aware of every eye in the hall resting on him. He had not prepared an answer. He had not even planned to step down that ladder 5 minutes earlier. Yet the longer he stayed silent, the heavier the moment became. Slowly he lifted his head enough to meet her gaze. "I am not part of your empire," Ethan said carefully, making sure every word was clear. "I do not know your politics or your traditions." A faint ripple of murmurs moved through the nobles at the admission, but the queen raised one hand slightly and the whispers faded. Ethan continued, his voice calm even though his heart was beating faster than it had during any repair job. "But where I come from, when someone stands alone and everyone else chooses pride over respect, somebody should still show the respect. That is all this is. Nothing more." For a second the hall returned to complete silence again. Queen Lyriath did not react immediately. Instead, her gaze shifted briefly toward the rows of nobles surrounding them, then returned to the human kneeling before her. Something subtle changed in her expression then, not dramatic enough for most of the court to notice, but Ethan saw it clearly. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, as if the weight pressing on the moment had shifted by a fraction. Very slowly she extended one hand toward him, not in command, but in invitation. "Rise, Ethan Walker of Earth," she said softly, her voice carrying through the chamber with unexpected warmth. "Your gesture has already spoken louder than this entire court." For a moment Ethan Walker did not move. The Queen's hand remained extended toward him, steady and patient, while the entire throne hall watched as if time itself had slowed. Ethan had spent most of his life repairing broken equipment inside noisy engine rooms and cramped service corridors, not standing in the center of a royal court beneath a ceiling nearly 100 feet high. The idea that the ruler of an interstellar empire now knew his full name felt strangely unreal. Still kneeling, he hesitated only a second longer before placing his hand lightly in hers and rising to his feet. The contact surprised him. Her skin was cool, but not cold, smooth like polished stone warmed by soft light. Queen Lyriath released his hand almost immediately, yet the simple gesture seemed to shift something invisible inside the hall. Ethan noticed it first in the nobles. Their expressions had changed. Confusion had turned into something sharper. Some faces showed irritation, others disbelief, and a few carried the tight, controlled smiles of people who did not appreciate unexpected disruptions. The ancient ceremony had already been broken, but now it had been broken by someone who technically did not belong to their society at all. One of the older nobles near the front row stepped forward half a pace, the jewels woven into his deep violet robes catching the lantern light. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, his tone respectful but strained, "this individual is not a member of the imperial houses. The renewal ceremony exists for those who hold responsibility within the empire. A human technician does not alter its meaning." His words were calm, yet the message underneath was clear. The gesture should not count. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle across the chamber. Queen Lyriath did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned slightly and looked toward the cracked crown still resting on the marble floor. The crown had been part of the empire for generations, its silver arcs designed to reflect the light of distant stars. Now it lay tilted on its side only a few feet away from where Ethan had knelt moments earlier. Slowly the queen walked toward it. The nobles parted just enough to allow her passage, their silence returning like a heavy curtain across the room. When she reached the crown, she bent slightly and lifted it with both hands. For a brief moment, she simply studied it, the fractured edge reflecting the violet lantern glow. Then she turned back toward the gathered court. "Tradition," she said quietly, "is meant to remind us who we are." Her voice carried through the hall with effortless clarity. Yet tradition also reveals who we have become. She looked across the rows of nobles, her golden eyes calm but impossible to ignore. Today, every noble house was offered the same moment. A chance to kneel, not for power, not for politics, but for unity. No one accepted. A subtle ripple moved through the court as her words settled. Then she raised the crown slightly. And yet the only person in this hall who chose respect over pride was a man who owes this empire nothing. Ethan felt every eye in the room shift toward him again. The queen stepped closer and placed the crown gently back upon her head, the fractured edge barely visible beneath the silver arcs. "Perhaps," she continued softly, "the empire should consider what that says about us." The throne hall remained still after the queen placed the fractured crown back upon her head, but the silence no longer felt the same. A few minutes earlier the quiet had carried uncertainty and quiet rebellion, yet now something different moved through the chamber. It was not agreement, and it was certainly not loyalty, but it was awareness. The nobles understood that the moment had changed direction and that a human maintenance contractor had somehow become part of it. Ethan Walker stood where he had risen from his kneel, trying very hard not to look like the center of attention. Unfortunately, the entire court continued to glance toward him in small, cautious movements, as if he had become an unexpected symbol no one had planned for. He shifted his weight slightly on the marble floor and quietly adjusted the strap of the tool pouch still hanging from his belt. The small movement reminded him that he was still dressed like a man who had spent the morning repairing a ventilation unit rather than participating in a royal ceremony. From the corner of his eye, he could see several nobles studying him with expressions that ranged from irritation to curiosity. One noblewoman with deep silver robes leaned toward the figure beside her and whispered something behind her sleeve. Ethan did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Humans were still outsiders in this empire, and the idea that one had influenced the ceremony clearly unsettled them. Queen Lyriath seemed fully aware of the shifting tension around the room. She stepped away from Ethan and slowly walked across the polished floor toward the wide steps leading up to the throne platform. The crown now rested upon her head once more, the fractured edge barely visible beneath the graceful silver arcs. When she reached the first step, she turned again to face the court. The lantern light reflected across the smooth turquoise surface of her skin, and the silver markings along her temples glowed faintly like distant stars. "Today has revealed something important," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the hall with quiet authority. "The renewal ceremony is not a command. It is a choice. And today most of you chose silence." A ripple moved across the rows of nobles. No one interrupted, yet the unease was obvious. Some avoided her gaze entirely, while others watched her with careful, guarded expressions. The queen continued, her tone neither angry nor accusing, simply steady. "Empires do not weaken because of outside enemies. They weaken when those entrusted with responsibility begin measuring pride more carefully than unity." Her eyes moved slowly across the gathered houses before settling briefly on Ethan again. "And sometimes it takes a stranger to remind us what respect actually looks like." Ethan felt his ears grow warm at the unexpected attention. He had not intended to become an example in a speech about imperial responsibility. He had simply reacted to a moment that felt wrong. Still the court listened. The queen turned slightly toward the high palace doors at the far end of the hall, where soft daylight from the outer city filtered through tall crystal panels. "The empire stands at a difficult moment," she continued. "Our borders expand farther than ever before. Yet unity inside these walls has never felt more fragile. The ceremony today has shown me something clearly. Tradition alone cannot hold an empire together. Only choice can." She paused then, allowing the weight of the words to settle across the room. Around the hall, several nobles exchanged thoughtful glances, as if realizing that the ceremony had quietly become something far more significant than they expected. Queen Lyriath looked once more toward Ethan Walker, the human who had stepped down a service ladder and changed the direction of an entire court gathering without intending to. A small, thoughtful smile touched the edge of her expression before she spoke again. "And today one man who holds no title reminded this empire what that choice looks like." The throne hall did not erupt into applause or protest after the queen finished speaking. Instead, a quieter and far more complicated reaction unfolded across the chamber. The nobles did not like being confronted, especially in front of one another, yet none of them could openly challenge the truth that had just been spoken. Ethan Walker stood exactly where he had been since rising from his kneel, feeling more out of place with every passing second. Moments ago, he had simply been a maintenance technician trying to repair a malfunctioning ventilation unit. Now he was apparently the example being discussed by an entire imperial court. He slowly exhaled and glanced toward the upper wall, where the service ladder still waited nearly 40 feet above the marble floor. A part of him wondered if he could quietly climb back up there and disappear before anyone decided to ask him to explain himself again. Unfortunately, the situation did not seem interested in letting him disappear. Queen Lyriath stepped down from the first stair of the throne platform and approached the center of the hall once more. The movement drew the attention of every noble present. When she stopped a few feet from Ethan again, the room grew silent in the careful way people become quiet when they know something important is about to happen. The queen looked at him for a moment with the same thoughtful expression she had carried earlier, as if measuring not only the action he had taken, but the kind of person capable of taking it without hesitation. "Ethan Walker of Earth," she said calmly, "the Empire owes you clarity." Ethan blinked once, surprised by the direction the moment had taken. "I am not sure I did anything important, Your Majesty," he replied honestly. A few nobles near the front shifted at the sound of a human speaking directly to the queen with such plain language, yet Lyriath only gave a faint smile. "Important moments are rarely planned," she said. That is why they reveal so much about those who create them. She turned slightly, so that her voice carried toward the gathered court as well. You all witnessed the gesture made here today. Not by a soldier, not by a noble house, but by a man who does not even belong to our political structure. She paused briefly before continuing. That alone should invite reflection. Several nobles exchanged measured glances. One of the younger representatives from a distant house raised his chin slightly, as if preparing to speak, but the queen lifted her hand gently, and the motion stopped before it began. There will be time for discussion later, she said. For now the ceremony is concluded. The renewal ceremony always ended with a declaration that unity had been reaffirmed. Today that declaration could not honestly be made, and everyone in the hall knew it. Yet the queen had not allowed the moment to collapse into humiliation. Instead, she had quietly reshaped it into something that demanded thought rather than obedience. Slowly the nobles began to step back from the ceremonial floor, their robes whispering softly against the marble as they moved toward the outer aisles. Some still looked toward Ethan with guarded curiosity, while others avoided his direction entirely. The atmosphere in the hall had changed from confrontation to contemplation. Ethan watched the court begin to disperse and felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He had no idea what the long-term consequences of this moment might be for an entire empire, but he knew one thing for certain. His ventilation repair job had definitely taken a strange turn. As the nobles continued filing out through the towering crystal doors, Queen Lyriath remained where she stood, her golden eyes briefly following the human who had unknowingly shifted the direction of an ancient ceremony. The great crystal doors of the throne hall slowly began to close as the last groups of nobles stepped out into the bright corridors of the imperial palace. Their jeweled robes disappeared one by one beyond the tall arches, leaving the enormous chamber quieter than it had been at any point that day. The floating lanterns above continued to glow with their soft violet light, reflecting gently across the polished marble floor. Ethan Walker stood in the same place near the center of the hall, watching the final representatives of the noble houses depart. He had the strange feeling of being the last person who should still be standing there. The service ladder on the upper wall suddenly looked very appealing again. If he climbed it now, maybe he could finish repairing the ventilation unit and pretend the entire ceremony had been a very unusual lunch break. He shifted the strap of his tool pouch again and took a small step backward, quietly testing whether anyone would notice if he slipped away. That was when the calm voice of Queen Lyriath reached him again. Ethan Walker. The simple sound of his name stopped him mid-step. He turned slowly and saw that the queen had remained near the center of the hall while the nobles exited. Without the crowd surrounding them, the chamber suddenly felt even larger, the ceiling towering nearly 100 feet overhead and the rows of crystal pillars stretching away into quiet symmetry. The queen began walking toward him with measured steps, the silver arcs of her crown catching the lantern light as she moved. Now that the court had dispersed, the atmosphere felt very different. The tension of politics had faded, replaced by something calmer and more personal. When she stopped a few feet away, Ethan straightened slightly, unsure whether he should bow again or simply stand still. Lyriath studied him for a moment with thoughtful curiosity. Earlier you said that where you come from someone should still show respect when others refuse, she said. Ethan nodded once. Yes, Your Majesty. That is usually how my mother explained it. When I was growing up, a faint hint of amusement touched the queen's expression. Your mother must be a wise woman. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. She worked 2 jobs and still managed to keep my brother and me from becoming idiots. I think that qualifies as wisdom. For a brief second, the queen actually laughed softly, a quiet sound that echoed gently in the enormous hall. It was the first relaxed moment either of them had experienced since the ceremony began. Lyriath then looked toward the cracked crown resting against her temples, her fingers touching the silver edge as if acknowledging its presence. The empire has been standing on fragile ground for some time, she said more quietly now. Many within the noble houses believe strength means never appearing uncertain. Today they tried to show that belief by refusing the ceremony. Ethan considered that for a moment before replying. Where I come from, pretending everything is perfect usually means the problem is about to get worse. The queen studied him again with that same calm, analytical gaze. You are not trained in diplomacy, Ethan Walker. No, Your Majesty, he answered honestly. I mostly repair air circulation systems and replace faulty wiring. Lyriath nodded slightly, as if that fact somehow made his earlier gesture even more interesting. Sometimes the clearest truths come from people who are not trying to win an argument, she said. She paused, then added in a thoughtful tone, which may explain why an empire full of powerful nobles needed a maintenance technician to remind them what respect looks like. For a few seconds the enormous throne hall felt almost peaceful. The nobles had gone, the echo of their footsteps fading far down the palace corridors, leaving only the soft hum of the imperial power grid and the distant whisper of climate systems moving air through hidden vents high in the walls. Ethan Walker finally let out a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. The tension of standing in front of an entire alien court was beginning to fade, and the familiar instinct of a technician slowly returned to his mind. Problems appeared. Systems malfunctioned. Someone fixed them. Life continued. That simple pattern was the closest thing he had to a philosophy. Queen Lyriath watched him quietly for a moment, as if she could almost see those thoughts moving through his mind. You are thinking about leaving? She said calmly. Ethan gave a small, embarrassed smile. Yes, Your Majesty. My ventilation unit is still broken, and if the air circulation fails on the upper level, someone is eventually going to blame the maintenance department. The Queen glanced briefly toward the upper wall where the service ladder still rested nearly 40 feet above the marble floor. It was a small detail in such an enormous chamber, yet now that the ceremony had ended it felt strangely important again. The Empire survives political disagreements every day, she said thoughtfully. But a palace with broken ventilation becomes uncomfortable very quickly. Ethan nodded in agreement. That is the most practical sentence I have heard all day. For a moment neither of them spoke. The vast hall stretched around them in quiet symmetry, the floating crystal lanterns casting soft reflections across the polished stone floor. Without the crowd the space felt less like a political arena and more like a place built for reflection. Finally Lyriath stepped closer to one of the tall crystal pillars near the center of the chamber and rested her hand lightly against its smooth surface. You acted without hesitation earlier, she said. Most individuals would have remained hidden in the service corridor and avoided involvement. Ethan considered that for a second before answering. I almost did exactly that. But when everyone refused to kneel, it felt strange watching someone stand alone like that. The Queen turned slightly toward him. Even when that someone is not human. Ethan shrugged gently. Respect works the same way no matter the species where I come from. Someone either deserves it or they do not. Titles do not really change the answer. The Queen studied him again with that calm analytical gaze that seemed to measure both honesty and intention at the same time. Your simplicity is unusual in a palace full of strategy, she said quietly. I am not simple, Ethan replied with a faint grin. I just fix problems that have clear instructions. Politics does not come with an instruction manual. The Queen actually smiled at that. Perhaps that is why politics fails so often. She paused for a moment before continuing in a more thoughtful tone. The nobles believed refusing the ceremony would weaken the throne. Instead it revealed something else entirely. She gestured subtly toward him. That leadership cannot exist without someone willing to stand beside it when it becomes difficult. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable at being described that way. I only knelt once, he said. That does not make me part of your government. Lyriath nodded slowly. No, she said. But it may have reminded this empire what its government is supposed to protect. The quiet words drifted gently through the vast chamber, and for the first time since the ceremony began the throne hall no longer felt like a battlefield of pride, but something closer to a place where the future of an empire might quietly begin to change. For a few quiet seconds neither of them moved. The enormous throne hall stood around them like a cathedral built for an empire that suddenly felt uncertain about itself. The crystal lanterns above continued their gentle glow, casting pale reflections across the marble floor that stretched almost 200 feet from wall to wall. Ethan Walker looked around the empty chamber and then back toward the service ladder high along the wall. The broken ventilation system still waited for him, and for a moment, he considered returning to the safe comfort of tools and wires where problems followed predictable rules. But the Queen remained standing near the central pillar, watching the quiet hall with thoughtful eyes. The ceremony may be over, Lyriath said slowly, but the consequences are only beginning. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Consequences usually follow when people make decisions they were not expecting to make. The Queen glanced toward him with mild curiosity. That sounds like experience speaking. Ethan gave a small shrug. Where I come from we call it Tuesday. Something always breaks, and someone always wishes it had not. The Queen allowed herself a faint smile before her expression returned to something more contemplative. The nobles who refused the ceremony will not forget what happened today. Some will claim your gesture embarrassed them. Others will say it gave me an advantage I did not earn. Ethan folded his arms lightly and leaned against the base of one of the crystal pillars. People who refuse to show respect usually do not enjoy being reminded of it. That reaction is fairly universal. The Queen studied him for a moment longer, as if confirming that the human standing in front of her truly spoke, without calculation. You understand politics better than you believe, she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. Immediately. No, Your Majesty. I understand people. Machines are honest. When a system fails, it gives you a clear signal. People are more complicated, but the warning signs are similar. The Queen raised one brow slightly with interest. Warning signs. Ethan nodded toward the great doors where the nobles had exited earlier. When a room full of powerful individuals refuses to perform a simple act of unity, something underneath the system has already started breaking. Liriath looked toward the tall crystal doors as well, the reflection of distant city lights faintly visible through their transparent surface. That observation is precisely why the ceremony existed in the first place, she said. It was meant to reveal loyalty before greater problems appeared. Ethan tilted his head again thoughtfully. Sounds like the Empire ignored the early maintenance warnings. The Queen gave a quiet laugh at the unexpected comparison. Perhaps we did. She turned slightly, so that she faced the throne platform again, the silver arcs of her crown catching the lantern light as she moved. Empires, like machines, can survive a surprising amount of strain before they fail. But eventually someone must repair the system or it collapses under its own weight. Ethan glanced at the throne rising behind her, and then back at the Queen herself. With respect, Your Majesty, I do not think kneeling once qualifies me as a repair technician for an empire. Liriath looked at him with calm certainty. No, Ethan Walker. But it may have reminded the Empire that someone still believes it is worth repairing. The quiet inside the throne hall lingered like the final note of a song that had not yet decided whether it should end. Ethan Walker remained leaning lightly against the smooth crystal pillar, his arms folded loosely while he studied the enormous chamber around them. The longer he stood there, the more he realized how different the room felt without the presence of the nobles. When it had been full of voices and ceremonial tension, it felt like a stage built for power. Now it felt more like an empty engine room after the machines had been shut down, waiting for someone to decide how the system would run tomorrow. Queen Liriath stepped slowly toward the wide windows at the far end of the hall, where the outer city stretched beyond the palace walls. Through the transparent crystal panels, the lights of the imperial capital glowed across miles of distant towers and suspended skyways. Hundreds of aerial transports drifted through the evening air, like silent fireflies moving between buildings that reached nearly half a mile into the sky. For a moment, the Queen simply looked out across her city without speaking. Ethan eventually pushed himself away from the pillar and walked a few steps closer, careful not to stand too near the throne platform behind her. It is a very impressive view, he said quietly. Liriath nodded slightly. The capital covers more than 800 square miles. When the Empire first began expanding beyond this planet, the founders believed a great city would remind future generations of what unity could create. Ethan studied the distant skyline for a moment. On Earth, most cities grew that large because no one could agree where to stop building. The Queen turned toward him again, her golden eyes reflecting the lights of the city behind her. You see flaws in grand designs very easily. Ethan gave a small shrug. Anyone who repairs machinery learns that even the most impressive systems still rely on small parts working correctly. If one piece fails long enough, the entire structure begins to shake. Liriath looked thoughtful at that comparison. The nobles believe they are the structure holding the empire together, she said. But today many of them forgot that loyalty is also a small piece that must function properly. Ethan nodded slowly. Pride is usually the first component to stop working when systems start failing. The Queen allowed herself another faint smile at the human description. You speak about an empire as if it were an engine. That is because engines make sense, Ethan replied. You can hear when they struggle. Politics is quieter, but the symptoms are still there if you listen carefully. The queen folded her hands lightly in front of her and considered the nearly empty hall again. Do you know why the renewal ceremony was created centuries ago, Ethan Walker? Ethan shook his head. I only saw the last 10 minutes of it. It was meant to prevent the empire from becoming comfortable with silence, she explained. When leaders refuse to kneel together, it reveals the moment unity begins to fade. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then today was a very honest ceremony. Lirith met his gaze calmly. Yes, she said. And honesty is often the beginning of change. Ethan glanced once more at the service ladder high along the wall, and then back at the queen. Well, if the empire is going through a maintenance phase, I suppose someone should start fixing the ventilation system first. For the first time since the ceremony began, the queen laughed openly, the sound echoing gently through the massive chamber. Perhaps that is exactly where this empire should begin. The laughter faded gently through the enormous throne hall, leaving behind a quieter atmosphere that felt almost unfamiliar after the tension of the ceremony. Ethan Walker rubbed the back of his neck slightly, still adjusting to the strange reality that he had just made the ruler of an interstellar empire laugh, while wearing a grease-marked maintenance jacket. For a moment, he looked back up toward the service ladder high along the wall, calculating the climb in his head. 40 feet was not difficult, but the moment felt oddly unfinished, as if leaving immediately might interrupt something that had only just begun. Queen Lirith seemed to sense the same thing. She walked slowly back toward the center of the hall, the faint sound of her steps echoing across the marble floor as the lantern light shimmered along the silver arcs of her crown. When she stopped beside the great circular emblem carved into the stone beneath the throne platform, she looked down at it thoughtfully. The emblem represented the founding moment of the empire centuries earlier, a star surrounded by 13 rings symbolizing the original houses that had once united to build something larger than themselves. Today the symbol looked almost ironic. The houses still existed, but unity had clearly become more complicated. Ethan stepped a little closer, careful not to cross the invisible boundary that marked the ceremonial center of the chamber. That symbol has probably seen a lot of arguments over the years, he said quietly. Lirith nodded slightly without looking away from it. Empires are built from agreements, she replied, but they survive through trust. When trust begins to fade, agreements alone cannot hold everything together. Ethan studied the carved rings for a moment before answering. Where I grew up, when a machine starts shaking, the first thing you do is tighten the loose connections. The queen glanced toward him again with quiet curiosity. And if the connections refuse to tighten? Ethan thought about that for a second. Then, you start replacing the parts that stop doing their job. The honesty in his voice made the statement sound less like criticism and more like simple mechanical logic. Lirith slowly lifted her gaze from the emblem and looked toward the distant palace doors where the nobles had exited earlier. Many of those houses believe they are irreplaceable, she said softly. Ethan gave a small half-smile. Most components believe that until someone installs a better one. The queen considered that response for several seconds, then gave a small, thoughtful nod. Your people approach problems differently than ours. Ethan shrugged lightly. Humans learned early that systems only work when everyone understands the purpose of the machine. If someone forgets the purpose, the machine starts serving itself instead of the people using it. The queen walked a few steps closer again until they stood only a few feet apart near the center of the hall. The lantern light reflected faintly in her golden eyes as she studied the human technician who had unknowingly stepped into a political moment that would likely be discussed across the empire for weeks. You may not realize it yet, Ethan Walker, she said quietly, but the gesture you made today will travel far beyond this palace. Ethan blinked once at that. I only knelt for about 5 seconds. Lirith gave a faint smile. Sometimes 5 seconds is enough to remind an entire civilization what respect looks like. The quiet in the throne hall deepened again after the queen's words, settling over the enormous chamber like evening lights spreading across still water. Ethan Walker looked down briefly at the polished marble beneath his boots, thinking about what she had just said. 5 seconds did not feel like much when you were fixing a ventilation system or tightening a loose panel inside a machine. But apparently, in a palace full of powerful leaders, it could carry a very different weight. He rubbed his hands together lightly, the familiar habit of someone who had spent years working with tools rather than politics. "Your Majesty," he said after a moment, "I should probably make sure I did not accidentally start a crisis." The Queen tilted her head slightly with curiosity. "You believe your gesture caused one?" Ethan gave a small, uncertain smile. "I believe if a room full of important people refuses to kneel, and then a random maintenance guy does it instead, someone is eventually going to write a very uncomfortable report about it." Lyriath studied him for a moment before allowing another quiet smile. "Reports are already being written," she said calmly. "The court recorders captured everything that happened during the ceremony. By now the Imperial archives have likely preserved the moment several dozen times." Ethan blinked once. "Several dozen. The Empire values documentation," the Queen replied. "Important moments are rarely understood immediately. Future generations often study them to determine when change first began." Ethan exhaled slowly and glanced around the vast chamber again, imagining historians centuries later analyzing the moment a human technician knelt in an alien court. That sounds like a lot of pressure for 5 seconds. Lyriath walked slowly toward the throne platform again, her gaze drifting briefly across the carved imperial emblem on the floor. "History rarely asks permission before assigning importance," she said quietly. "Sometimes it simply chooses a moment and waits for people to recognize it later." Ethan considered that for a moment and then shrugged lightly. "Well, if historians are looking for deep political meaning, they might be disappointed. I mostly reacted because the situation felt wrong." The Queen stopped at the base of the throne steps and turned back toward him. "That may be exactly why the moment mattered," she said. "When leaders hesitate because they are calculating consequences, respect often disappears. You acted before calculation replaced instinct." Ethan crossed his arms thoughtfully. "Where I come from we call that doing the right thing before your brain has time to talk you out of it." Lyriath nodded slowly, as if that explanation confirmed something she had already begun to suspect. "Many rulers spend their lives surrounded by strategy," she said. "It becomes easy to forget that the foundation of authority is not power, but trust." Ethan looked up toward the towering ceiling where the lanterns floated like distant stars. "Trust is easier to build when people believe someone is still paying attention to the basics." The Queen followed his gaze briefly, then returned her attention to him. "Perhaps today reminded this empire of those basics," she said quietly. For a moment neither of them spoke again. The throne hall stood silent and immense around them, a place that had witnessed centuries of decisions, alliances, and ceremonies that shaped the direction of countless worlds. Yet the most important moment of that day had lasted only a few seconds. Ethan finally looked back toward the service ladder high along the wall and nodded slightly to himself. "I should still repair that ventilation system," he said. "Even empires need fresh air if they are going to think clearly about the future." The throne hall remained vast and quiet as Ethan Walker looked one more time toward the service ladder high along the wall. The distance from the marble floor to the maintenance corridor above was just under 40 feet, a climb he had made dozens of times before during routine repair calls inside the palace systems. Normally, it would have been the least remarkable part of his day. Yet today nothing about the situation felt routine anymore. Behind him Queen Lyriath stood near the base of the throne platform, her posture relaxed now that the ceremony and the watching court had disappeared from the room. The floating crystal lanterns above continued their soft glow, reflecting gently across the polished floor and the carved imperial emblem between them. Ethan finally exhaled slowly and gave a small nod to himself as if reaching a quiet conclusion. "Well, Your Majesty," he said, "I suppose history can wait a few minutes while someone makes sure the air circulation system does not embarrass the Empire again tomorrow." Lyriath smiled faintly at the practical simplicity of the statement. "That seems like a very reasonable priority," she replied. Ethan turned toward the ladder and took a few steps across the marble floor, the echo of his boots sounding strangely loud in the enormous empty chamber. Just before reaching the wall, he paused and glanced back toward the Queen. "Thank you for not having me arrested earlier," he said honestly. On Earth, kneeling in front of the wrong leader sometimes leads to complicated misunderstandings. The Queen's expression softened with quiet amusement. "I suspect if I had ordered your arrest, the entire moment would have lost its meaning," she said. "Respect cannot be commanded. That is why it matters when it appears freely." Ethan nodded once in agreement before gripping the first rung of the ladder. The cool metal felt familiar beneath his hands, grounding him again in the kind of work he actually understood. As he climbed upward, the distance between the floor and the maintenance corridors slowly closed, each step carrying him farther away from the center of the enormous chamber, where the day's unexpected moment had unfolded. When he finally pulled himself onto the narrow service platform, he glanced down once more. From above, the throne hall looked even larger, the marble floor stretching like a polished mirror beneath the lantern light. Queen Lyriath still stood near the center of the room, her silver crown reflecting the glow of the floating crystals as she watched the quiet space around her. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she spoke softly, not loudly enough for the words to echo through the hall, but clearly enough that Ethan heard them from the railing above. Sometimes the future of an empire begins with the smallest gesture. Ethan rested his arms on the metal railing and looked down at her with a thoughtful half-smile. "Where I come from, Your Majesty," he replied. "People say something similar." Lyriath lifted her gaze toward him, curious. "And what do they say?" Ethan considered the enormous hall, the silent throne, and the quiet city lights glowing through the distant windows before answering. "They say that the strongest systems are not built by powerful people trying to control everything. They are built by ordinary people remembering to do the right thing when it would have been easier not to." The queen held his gaze for a moment, then slowly nodded. The lantern light shimmered across the chamber as silence returned once more. And in that quiet space the empire, though still uncertain, suddenly felt a little more hopeful than it had earlier that day.